as we speak, this sunrise sector is going through a funding winter right now. We have entered into a bearish investment cycle where the risk appetite is low and the cost of capital has become high. In this context, the startup and venture capital community might look for some kind of a systemic support in terms of the policy framework, in terms of incentives. Karthik, you are the chairperson of Indian Venture Capital Association too. Are there specific pain points which the venture capital community would like to get addressed in this union budget?
So I think it's the 7th anniversary since Startup India got kicked off. And therefore we get a lot of dialogue going. I'm not denying that opportunity at all. I would argue that prior to that, there wasn't even a dialogue. Yeah. The only correction I would make is that it has nothing to do with the funding winter. I don't think you're asking for concessions. I think that approach is incorrect, and it sort of diminishes the efforts of both the entrepreneurs and the venture industry. No one's asking for freebies in some sense. What we are asking for is that we look at regulation progressively to be able to look like world-class entrepreneurs and world-class venture capitalists, right? Because I don't think we are building in a vacuum. We might be building for India, we might be building Indian startups that are going globally, but we're building in a globally competitive environment. So most of the capital, as we know in venture, comes from overseas, both doubly so for the funds and somewhat true for even the underlying portfolio companies. So your benchmarks in terms of standards, governance, ease of doing business, capital coming in and going out of the country, terms that they get, have to be equal or better than the rest of the world. Can't be equal or worse. We haven't even reached equal, is my humble submission, right? And so if we reach equal, then we can say we've given the industry enough firepower to fight. And we are not realizing that capital gets deflected to an American startup or a Chinese startup or an Israeli startup. It has nothing to do, there's no love for India, like specifically. Capital is very objective in the way it looks for returns. And so therefore, when you're competing for a global resource, then you have to be globally competitive. And I feel some of our regulations hold us back in that sense, right? So for example, if RBI has a view on overseas investments, the question is, are you hampering or enabling us to become competitive entrepreneurs globally, right? And is the Indian fund manager looking weaker or stronger in that context? If SEBI is setting certain regulations, do we as AIFs, I think Sateesh and me fall in that category, do we look uncompetitive relative to our peer who's 2 doors away, but who's not an AIF? He's Indian, sits here, but manages a fund which is not registered in India. And somehow he looks more competitive than me. So I have a problem with that. So fundamentally, that's all we're saying, right? We're not asking for freebies. We're not asking for concessions. We're saying it's 2023. If India needs to get to where it needs to, and you said 1 million jobs and you gave a lot of credit to the startup movement, I would say the reach is far, far, far wider. We don't need to directly employ people. We impact productivity of the country and the speed at which this economy can grow far more than simply just the jobs and capital and value creation piece alone. Yeah. And so the trickle-down effects are massive, and by slowing us down, we are slowing that goal of 10 and 20 and $30 trillion, which is what we really need for an economy or a population of our size. And so enabling us is always seeking.
I think just to double click on some of the things that Karthik kind of talked about, issues have been there for fund managers, issues have been there for startups. Simply, if you really look at from a startup perspective, I hope something like GIFT comes up for startups, right? So a GIFT is for funds now where, obviously your regulatory authority or your presence in GIFT could be as good as it is in Mauritius or in Singapore. Similarly, if there was an equivalent setup for startups, you don't need to go, register a company in Singapore or Delaware, right? can you, obviously work on it? The other piece from a fund perspective, there are a set of issues, how you treat the ownership of equity in a private company versus a public company, then treatment of even, kind of the carry, the GST, as well as treating it as an income from a tax perspective. I mean, these are issues. But attracting growth capital, I think to me, if you are transparent, if you give that visibility, and if you make, all of them look competitive, capital will follow.
Today, the way M&As happen, and especially if you look at it from a capital gains perspective, it's not tax efficient to actually do an M&A in this country, especially if you're a startup where you probably want to do an equity swap kind of a model. It is not tax efficient at all for the person who's getting acquired, and that's the reason probably it's not like the easiest of routes as well. Most of the large organizations, when they're doing an M&A, it's mostly a cash deal. You barely see consolidation happening with kind of an equity model because it's just not tax efficient. I think the M&A rules created for our country are probably not tailored well for some of the younger organizations, or some of the organizations which are still in a growth phase, and looking to probably bring in more consolidation at a slightly more earlier stage than some of the larger ones. So I think there's a lot more to be done. There's a lot more debate that needs to happen around it. And I think that's one piece of thing we expect probably in the coming years to probably ease out for some of the younger stage companies.